On the evening of May 25th, 2020, officers responded to a call on 38th and Chicago in South Minneapolis of a man reportedly using a forged $20 bill to purchase cigarettes. The man, George Floyd, was sitting in a car with his friend when officers arrived, pulled out their guns, and ordered him out of his vehicle. After handcuffing the man, the officers attempted to put him into their squad car. Floyd resisted, saying he was claustrophobic. During the altercation, a number of other officers, including Officer 𝗖𝗢𝗡, arrived at the scene. 𝗖𝗢𝗡 pulled Mr. Floyd away from the car at one point, causing him to fall to the ground, where he lay face down, still restrained by handcuffs, apparently in a distressed state. Witnesses began filming as a crowd formed around the altercation. The officers further restrained Mr. Floyd as 𝗖𝗢𝗡 placed his knee on Mr. Floyd's neck. What followed was 9 minutes of footage that would lead to George Floyd's and weeks of collective uprising against police violence across the United States and throughout the world. A final straw amid global pandemic tensions and after centuries of oppression and murder at the hands of racist police forces. Last month, after a 2-year investigation, the U.S. Justice Department's Civil Rights Division dropped a scathing 89-page report on the Minneapolis Police Department and the city of Minneapolis, finding that what happened to George Floyd was part of widespread, systemic problems in the MPD, a truth that residents here in Minneapolis, where I live, already knew too well. And while corrupt, violent police are not unique to the United States, it is unique among similarly situated Western countries. So I set out to figure out why. What is it about our history, our culture, and our police that set us apart in all measurable ways from other similar countries? The answer is messy and layered, but one thing is clear. We have a serious problem, and serious solutions need to be pushed at every level of government, from your local city council all the way to Congress. This is why US police are so corrupt. Roll the intro. Thank you to my partner on today's video, 𝗪𝗑𝗧𝗪. You guys know I love 𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪. I get so many compliments on these glasses. I have a pair of these gold boys. I actually have 2 of these. And I love 𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪 because they have this at-home try-on kit where you can order 5 frames to try on at home for free. The box comes with a return shipping label and you just send it back. No purchase necessary. It's super convenient. And 𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪 offers eyeglasses, contact lenses, eye exams at one of their 190 locations throughout the United States, and they offer sunglasses. I don't know about you, but I spent a lot of my adult life wearing $10 sunglasses without a prescription and then having a hard time driving or seeing anything. Or sometimes I would do the thing where you wear your prescription glasses and then you plop your $10 sunglasses over top. Embarrassing. Grow up. I love my 𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪 sunglasses. And when you get prescription sunglasses for the first time, it really is life-changing. Now, even though I already have a bunch of 𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪s, I ordered myself an at-home try-on kit right here with 5 different frames in it to try on for you today. I'm going for a masculine look, but I've also been looking for some black frames. What do you think about these? How about these? These are my scientist frames, I think. Nerd. How about a matte black moment? Love that. Or we have 2 silver boys. This one, a little bit understated. Nerdy librarian girl. Or these, which I think are my favorite, are like 70s and hip. What do you think? And when you order 2 pairs of eyeglasses or sunglasses from 𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪, you get 15% off. So order your home try-on kit today and get 5 frames to try on at home for free with a return shipping label included. You can order that kit by going to 𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪�ึ Thanks, 𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗙𝗙 force, including unjustified deadly force, unlawfully discriminates against Black and Native American people, violates the rights of people engaged in protected speech, and both MPD and the city, led by the absolutely cringeworthy, incompetent Mayor Jacob Frey, discriminate against people with behavioral health disabilities when responding to calls for assistance. The report also found persistent deficiencies in MPD's accountability systems, training, supervision, and officer wellness programs, which contribute to violations of the Constitution and federal law. And while the report was certainly damning, it merely confirmed what residents here, especially Black residents, have known for their entire lives, and it is by no means unique to Minneapolis. this. In the United States, we have the lowest police training requirements of any similar country by far. US police officers are more heavily armed than most other countries, as are the people they police. In Iceland, Ireland, New Zealand, Norway, and the UK, police are largely unarmed. In Iceland, where gun ownership is common, the country has recorded 1 police-involved shooting death in its history. In Ireland, most police aren't even trained to use firearms. In the UK, police have themselves resisted calls for them to bear arms, saying it goes against their philosophy of policing by consent, meaning that their legitimacy is contingent on public approval of their actions, as opposed to brute force. What a concept. The rate of civilians killed by police annually in the US is more than 3 times higher than Canada and 4 times higher than Australia. And yes, that's controlling for population size. And of course, as we saw in the recent police killing and subsequent riots in France, violence, especially against minorities at the hands of police, is not unique to the United States, but it's the rate of that violence in the US that is staggering. Black people are dramatically overrepresented in the number of police killings in this country. While they make up only 12% of the US population, they represent over a quarter of all killings by police, often while being unarmed, unthreatening, and actively experiencing a mental health crisis. And while current policing standards and tactics are to blame, to get at the root of how we got here, we have to look at our history. In the early American colonies, policing was used as a means of securing private property and businesses from thieves and bandits, usually fueled by fear of Native Americans coming and encroaching on their settlements in the night. So night watchmen and patrols were organized on a local level, and sometimes night watch was even doled out as punishment for misdeeds. In the North, night watchmen were mainly concerned with enforcing puritanical rules against gambling and sex work, though because night watch duty was often given as punishment, it often led the night watchmen to engage in the vices they were meant to be policing. Sound familiar? As the South expanded and the slave trade was brought to the colonies, patrolmen and night watchmen were charged with policing enslaved Africans. The slave patrol and slave catchers were the first form of organized police in the South, originating in the colony of Carolina. They were the first professional law enforcers tasked with enforcing the slave codes, stopping any black person they saw, and chasing runaways. The idea of a centralized municipal police force originated in the UK around the turn of the 19th century. In rapidly urbanizing areas, moral reform, enforcement of the laws, and discipline of the new class of industrial laborers was thought to require a strong central policing body to maintain social order. And it wasn't long before that idea spread to the United States. The Boston Municipal Police Force was started in 1838 in response to influxes of immigrants from Germany and Ireland, immigrants who were seen as dangerous others that required additional surveillance and control. Sound familiar? And of course, it wasn't long after then that the police forces started experiencing widespread corruption. By the 1850s, U.S. police forces were prone to the gambling, booze, and sex workers that they were meant to be policing, and police captains and sergeants were appointed by politicians and used to harass their political opponents and to harass voters into voting certain ways. Then came the Civil War and the passage of the 13th Amendment in 1865, which provided that neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States. The Reconstruction era began in the South, along with the passage of the Black Codes, which controlled where formerly enslaved people could go, work, live, travel, and how much they could be paid, essentially criminalizing all forms of Black freedom. And because the 13th Amendment explicitly allowed for the enslavement and involuntary servitude of convicted criminals, it meant that the newly freed population of formerly enslaved people were at the mercy of a corrupt police force that knew that once Black people were found to be criminals, they would be put back into their place. And thanks to the Black Codes, that pattern of mass incarceration of Black people started swiftly. The codes included very broad vagrancy laws that criminalized unemployed Black people, and any Black person who challenged the terms of their work by negotiating for higher salary, walking away from an abusive employer, or turning down a bad offer would then be criminalized for vagrancy because they were unemployed and therefore no longer protected by the 13th Amendment while incarcerated. And under the convict leasing system, prisons would lease their detainees to private companies who would earn huge profits off the backs of incarcerated Black people working in mining, railroads, and other industries. Police, as arbiters and enforcers of the law, served as the ultimate reminder to Black people of their lower status in society, and it ensured that wealthy, powerful people could continue to extract labor from Black bodies. And people knew their police forces were corrupt, especially during Prohibition, when many cops fell in with organized crime rings that proliferated during this period. So in 1929, President Hoover appointed the 11-member Wickersham Commission to examine the corruption in America's law enforcement. Over the course of 2 years, they produced volumes of reports documenting widespread corruption. The resulting reforms included a remapping of police precincts to reduce the chance of political influence, increased recruitment standards, and diversification of police officers from different communities. By the 1950s, reforms in the police force prioritized quote-unquote professionalism. Efforts to consolidate and centralize police forces were intended to help maintain order and prevent corruption. The goal was to create a sense of police omnipresence, so criminals never felt outside the watchful eye of the law. Policing became a full-blown career path, and centralization and the quasi-militaristic ranking within the system caused departments to become more disconnected from the public. And while these reforms curbed some of the flagrant corruption in earlier police forces, it did nothing to root out the inherent racism that had existed as the foundational pretext for the existence of those police departments to begin with. And this reality was put on stark display in the 1960s during the Civil Rights Movement, when the new nightly news and newspapers published disturbing photographs of police brutality during street protests, with many cops resorting to horseback, whips, and dogs as a means of controlling the masses, tactics that harkened back to the original slave chasers from whence the police departments came. In retaliation, Lyndon B. Johnson announced his war on crime through the passage of the Crime Control and Safe Streets Act of 1968, which created grants for local police to purchase military-grade weapons to suppress riots. This change sent an increasingly militarized police force into largely impoverished black neighborhoods, increasing surveillance and criminalization of those communities. The practice called stop and frisk was all but codified into law in 1968 through the Supreme Court case Terry v. Ohio, which gave police officers legal authority to stop and search someone if they have reasonable suspicion that the person has committed, is committing, or is about to commit a crime. Stop and frisk was used for decades to disproportionately target young black men, and wasn't found to be an unconstitutional infringement against the Fourth Amendment's protection against searches and seizures until 2013. After LBJ's war on crime, Nixon's war on drugs further criminalized the black community by focusing heavily on the policing of heroin, which was running rampant in black communities at the time. And despite the fact that throughout history the police have been used to quell and prevent labor organizing, by the 70s and 80s police unions became a battleground, leading to widespread blue flus, a tactic the police would use to walk out on the job in retaliation for budget cuts or any other perceived wrongdoing. And while today nationwide union membership has dropped from its high in the 80s, higher membership rates among police unions today mean they have strong bargaining power to resist reform and extensive resources to influence campaigns and initiate litigation to block reform. For example, a single New York City police union has spent over $1 million on state and local races in the last decade. And at least one study has shown that after officers gain access to collective bargaining rights, there is a substantial increase in killings of civilians. So where does that leave us today? Today, state and local governments spend about $115 billion on police every year, most of it coming from taxpayer money, plus a $54 million chunk coming from federal funds distributed through grant programs. State to state and even county to county, training for police officers varies widely. In many instances, the hours of training required to become a gun-slinging police officer hover around 650 hours, while becoming a cosmetologist takes 3,000 hours, a plumber 3,500, and a lawyer, on average, 4,725 hours. And that last one, the amount of training it takes to be a lawyer, is important. To write the laws and interpret the laws for clients comes with a bachelor's degree, plus 3 additional years of schooling, multiple internships, and a rigorous bar exam, not to mention continuing education requirements and ethical standards that must be maintained. Cops are tasked with enforcing the laws that lawyers and legislators write, which requires often split-second interpretation of how the law applies to the specific situation they're responding to, all while holding a loaded gun. And on average, they have about 16 weeks of training, with nothing more than a high school diploma as a prerequisite and no national board of ethics or oversight unless you count the DOJ coming in after a tragedy to do an investigation. Make it make sense. In Europe, similar training programs require more than 3 years to complete. And as I said, the manner and type of training that police receive varies dramatically throughout the country. But on average, they're receiving 213 hours of operations training, which I assume means how to fill out and file the right paperwork after incidents, followed by 168 hours of firearms, self-defense, and use of force tactics, then 89 hours of self-improvement, unclear what that means, then 86 hours, or a little over 2 40-hour weeks, on legal education, 2 weeks on legal education, followed by a grand total of 13 hours of domestic violence training and 10 hours of mental health training. This despite the fact that most police killings start in response to non-violent offenses, cases where no crime was reported, and situations in which the victim was having a mental health crisis. Approximately 1 in 4 people shot and killed by police between 2015 and 2020 showed signs of mental illness. And there are mixed reports on whether the police are even effective at curbing crime at all, especially in cities with large Black populations. In those cities, research has shown that increasing police presence does nothing to curb violent crime, and instead increases the rate of arrest for petty, non-violent crime, like loitering and disorderly conduct, unnecessarily siphoning Black people, especially Black youth, into the criminal justice system. A recent study of the California police force found that LA County sheriff's officers spent 88% of their time on officer-initiated stops, and 79% of that time was spent on traffic violations. About 3 out of every 4 hours that Sacramento sheriff's officers spent investigating traffic violations were for stops that ended in warnings or no action. More of the department's budget was going towards fruitless traffic stops than in response to 911 calls, basically wasting millions of public dollars, especially considering that Black people were more than twice as likely than white residents to be stopped by sheriff's deputies in some of those counties. So we have an undertrained, heavily militarized, ineffective police force that's been found time and again to abuse its power, especially towards people of color, especially towards Black people. But we also have a country where its citizens are armed to the teeth, with very little by way of public assistance for mental health and addiction services, where most of its population is one $500 emergency away from homelessness, where a large portion of its population is actively experiencing homelessness, and where there is no safety net, and where institutionalized racism has left entire groups of people disenfranchised and economically bereft. All conditions that lead to increased levels of crime and incarceration in a community that is already overly policed and overly incarcerated. It's a mess. So where do we go from here? Well, as I've already said, the police unions are often fighting tooth and nail against reforms or budget cuts, but there has been some progress towards some semblance of reforms in the wake of George Floyd's death. The MPD has agreed to move forward with a consent decree as a result of this DOJ investigation. After George Floyd was murdered, MPD policy now prohibits neck restraints, and officers can't use certain crowd control weapons without approval of the MPD chief. After the MPD killed another man named 𝗲𝗓𝗏 during a no-knock warrant execution, MPD has banned the use of no-knock warrants. A no-knock warrant was what led to Breonna Taylor's death as well. Minneapolis has also launched a promising mental health response program where 911 dispatchers can send qualified mental health professionals to handle a non-threatening mental health crisis, as opposed to sending armed police officers with 10 hours of mental health training. And anecdotally, I have heard positive stories about their response in scenarios where a cop would have unnecessarily escalated the situation. But despite these reforms, unnecessary killings by cops have continued in Minneapolis. Our Black population continues to be incredibly segregated and over-policed. And the Minneapolis Police Department has been severely understaffed since George Floyd's killing, because residents fucking hate the cops, and for good reason, and the cops are undertrained and have no clue how to handle the situation. In 2021, 56% of voters in Minneapolis rejected a ballot question that would have removed the MPD from the city charter and replaced it with a public health-oriented Department of Public Safety. A move that would have signaled a sea change and brought about much-needed overhauls of a clearly broken policing system. Not to mention, just as a side note, that our mayor, Jacob Frey, is a useless Democrat who was actively booed off stage for his response during the riots after George Floyd's murder, who likes to show up and virtue signal at Juneteenth celebrations, literally what is happening here, while simultaneously begging the state for more police funding and lying to his constituents. And Black and brown people keep dying at the hands of cops. As Mother Jones put it after the no-knock killing of 𝗲𝗓𝗏, Minneapolis became globally infamous for anti-Black racism and police murder not because of just one policy, but because 𝗬𝗥𝗧𝗏, who trained Minneapolis cops for a living, felt it within his right to choke the life out of George Floyd on the corner of a busy intersection in front of a crowd of people in broad daylight over a $20 bill, because cops believe they can do that, here and elsewhere. And something needs to change. But people are scared out of their minds, which has led to things like that referendum being voted down and a whole lot of inaction. Because people, white people specifically, can't imagine a world without police to protect them, because we're the only ones who feel protected by them. And since the murder of George Floyd, many of us, myself included, have come to realize the blind spot that that privilege has afforded us. That I got to grow up feeling safe when I saw a cop car nearby, getting pulled over and not having to fear for my life. But for people who haven't realized that the cops are only protecting a very pale portion of us, the idea of abolishing the police seems absolutely insane. Imagine the chaos. Imagine the crime. But of course, for most people calling for the abolition of the police, it's not a call for anarchy to reign, for laws to be done away with, and for all of us to live in a state of perpetual self-defense against the masses. It's a call for a new form of law enforcement, one that is made by and for the community, to serve the community instead of terrorize it, to meet the community's actual needs for mental health intervention, for assistance during homelessness, etc. Because when you have an institution with centuries of violent precedent against minorities that was founded on the basis of controlling those minorities, maybe it's better to create a new institution altogether instead of working within the confines of an institution that has proven itself time and again to be impervious to reform. The problem, however, with reforming the police, or even with abolishing the police in favor of a community-centered public safety task force, is that we also have to consider the larger picture of the society we have built for ourselves. The police and their brutality don't exist in a bubble. They exist in a country with deep racial divides, where half of the populace is fear-mongered by Fox News to believe that black people and immigrants are the enemy. A country where there are approximately 120 guns per every 100 people, where any semblance of a public safety net has been systematically stripped away, so most people are a single $500 emergency away from homelessness, where people are struggling with addiction and mental health emergencies largely caused by the society they live in, where people have to work 3 jobs to make ends meet because minimum wage hasn't increased in decades, where entire generations have no hope of ever owning their own home or having any sort of support in their old age, where having a child is forced upon you, but you are given 0 resources once you bring that child into the world. This is an incredibly sick, addicted, unstable, and isolating society we've built for ourselves. It's everyone for themselves. And then we take some of those people, often some of the least educated among us, and we give them guns and military-grade weapons, and we say, all right, go enforce the law. Of course that's not going to work. So along with defunding the police, we also need funding for the basic human necessities that are not being met by our current societal configuration. That's jobs that actually pay a living wage. Or better yet, a universal basic income so that your survival isn't dependent upon how many hours you are able to labor. Mental health services, support for parents and children, access to abortion for people who aren't ready to be parents, stricter gun control laws so that people aren't wandering the streets with AR-15s, decriminalization of drugs, see Portugal for a promising example of how drug decriminalization can be done effectively, access to addiction care instead of stigmatization, and access to affordable housing for the unhoused. So instead of writing off the idea of police abolition, I would challenge you to consider whether the current configuration is even working, or who it's working for and why, and whether you might also want to live in a society that does better, because I sure as shit do. I've included some helpful links and resources below if you're still struggling with wrapping your head around the idea of police abolition and you want more information. If you like this video, you might also like my video on why Americans are so obsessed with guns. Thank you to my Patreon supporters, including my newest patrons, and an extra special shout out to my multi-platinum patron, 𝗦𝗏𝗢𝗥𝗧. If you're interested in behind-the-scenes content, access to my research and show notes, content about my dog, and all sorts of other stuff, consider joining me over on Patreon today. Thanks so much for watching, have a good day, bye-bye!